This is where I grew up, in the heart of the Gorge du Verdon, in the south of France. In a Tibetan Buddhist community called OKC. I was one of about 60 children there. That's me in the photo. I was 5 years old when my parents abandoned me here, in a place called Château du Soleil. My childhood was an endless cycle of praying and prostrating. I didn't see my mother for several years. I was subjected to beatings, food deprivation, and cold. Some of the girls I grew up with went through much worse, in the form of teachings and rituals that took years to be classified as rape. All in the name of a religion that to Westerners is above suspicion. Buddhism.
The 14th Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize.
This is not right. Teachers should not have sex with students.
My name is Ricardo. I'm now 40 years old. For 6 years, I've been fighting to bring our former master to justice in court. Lama Kunzang, Robert Spatz. Spatz is Belgian. He was one of the first Westerners to establish a Buddhist community in Europe. He's a recognized teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, a Lama. Here we go. Today, I'm the spokesperson for 23 plaintiffs in the case against Lama Kunzang.
Bonjour.
You're a plaintiff?
Oui, Ricardo Mendes. Ici, Marina.
He now lives in the south of Spain and declined to show up. He's on trial for exploitation of workers, holding children hostage, and sexual abuse.
Please be seated. So, we'll continue with Mr. Mendes. Do you wish to emphasize anything about the statements you've made?
Until this case began to consume my mind over the last 4 years, I had no idea about the definition of sexual abuse. I was haunted by the idea that these girls, by daring to go public, might be ruined. I decided we had to protect them. The thinking was, if we protect those who are most vulnerable, and we tell our own stories and make full disclosure to the court, then the truth would come out.
La vérité éclatera.
je vous en prie. Donc, vous voyagez.
You went with your parents to Château de Soleil in the south of France. You were with your
Vous
parents.
êtes avec vos parents.
Yes.
Et à un moment, vos parents.
And at some stage they left. Was there any physical abuse?
Corporel.
Alors, moi,
I got slapped. It's crazy, but I didn't think it was serious.
Moi, je pensais que c'était pas trop grave.
But I saw kids getting beaten in the
Moi,
stairwells.
j'ai vu des baffes tellement violentes
A
données dans des
child
cages
smashed against the wall, covered in blood.
se cogner contre un mur.
I have
et
many
se
visual
retrouver
memories
ensemble.
of violent
J'ai-
scenes.
J'ai beaucoup de souvenirs
Et
d'images
comment
très
est-ce qu'on-
violentes.
Comment est-ce
Et
qu'on réagissait par rapport?
How did you react to this violence?
C'était de la
I was
peur.
afraid.
Ouais.
Vous avez bénéficié.
Were you also given private lessons by Mr. Spatz?
Particulier avec Monsieur Spatz.
Oui.
Yes,
One-on-one?
Oui.
yes.
Est-ce que vous pouvez expliquer
Can you describe to us the nature of these lessons?
comment vous avez vécu ces enseignements?
En fait, il a commencé.
He began to summon me for private meetings when I was quite small.
Et je le rencontrais
This was in
dans-
his room beneath the tower.
Il m'a dit qu'il faut.
He told me to go to a small tower just behind his apartment.
Ses appartements le soir.
In the evening, discreetly, so as not to arouse any suspicion or jealousy.
Soupçon de personne ou la jalousie de personne.
That's how he presented it.
Qu'il le présentait
Oui.
et qu'il
I
fallait.
had to go to this tower in the evening and wait for him.
Avec mon
And
et que
bring
je
my
me
duvet
rendais
along, because I would be sleeping there for a few nights.
là quelques nuits.
Puis je suis montée dans la tour.
I went up into the tower.
C'est venu plus tard le
Spots
soir.
came later in the evening.
Et il s'est assis
He sat down and prayed with me.
avec moi. Et puis, à un
Then at
certain
some
moment,
stage, he began talking about spiritual energy.
Il a commencé à parler d'énergie spirituelle, etc. Et à toucher
He
mes
touched my
épaules.
shoulders, saying that spiritual energy was coursing through my body, which I should be able to feel.
Puis, bon, il a dit
He
que-
said I had to take off my clothes because they were blocking the energy.
Donc je me rappelle m'être endormie dans la.
I remember falling asleep in the tower because he didn't turn up.
Et en fait, parce qu'il ne venait pas.
Then I remember being woken up by him touching my private parts.
Parce qu'il était en train de me toucher les parties intimes.
Il m'a dit de me coucher
He told
sur
me
le
to lie naked on the floor.
et il a sorti
He
une
produced some sort of balm and started applying it to my breasts.
baume sur les seins. En fait, il m'avait
He
expliqué
explained to me that there was a lot of energy in the sexual organs and breasts
au niveau des seins,
because these were the major energy zones.
l'énergie. Et du coup, il a commencé à les
So he began to
stimuler
stimulate them
pour
in order to transfer the energy.
Spatz. Lui, il a été
Spots had achieved enlightenment.
comprend tout. Il
He understood everything.
sait ce qu'on pense.
He was
il sait
omnipresent.
ce qu'on dit. Il connaît notre
He knew what we were thinking and feeling.
d'autres bons
He knew our
karmas,
past
notre
lives, our good karma, our bad karma.
Il est très généreux parce que
He was
il a-
extremely generous because instead of living in nirvana, he chose to live on earth to help us
il vit sur
and be in this awful place where everyone was suffering.
il fait ça pour nous.
He was doing this for us. So he ordered us to do things that may have seemed unfair or odd, a little crazy or pointless.
Pas utile.
But we needed to follow his exact instructions to achieve enlightenment.
Comme ça qu'on va atteindre
Donc,
l'éveil.
si je vous entends bien, il faut
If I understand correctly, the Lama demanded blind obedience.
une obéissance aveugle.
Oui.
Yes. If I was raped in this life, it was because I must have been a man who raped a woman in a former life.
C'est un homme qui a violé
My punishment was to relive the experience as a woman to purge my bad karma. Lucky me. And become closer to enlightenment.
et je suis un peu plus proche de l'éveil. Voilà. C'est
Donc ça,
un
c'est
être-
ce que
That's what he taught you.
Oui.
I'm
oui,
describing
voilà,
what he
je
taught
l'ai
us.
enseigné.
Those were Mr. Spatz's teachings?
Voilà.
Yes.
As a child, I remember seeing all the great masters of Buddhism coming to meet Robert Spatz. Even the Dalai Lama visited him. However, during my investigation, I came across images that stunned me. In the early 90s, while we were suffering at the hands of Robert Spatz, a meeting was arranged between the Dalai Lama and Buddhist masters in the West. They spent hours talking about sexual and financial abuse within Buddhist communities. So Robert Spatz was not an isolated case.
I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think there was something like 25 or 30 Western Buddhist teachers from different traditions. We met with the Dalai Lama, I think, about 7 or 8 times over 3 days. He was very generous with his time. The conference began with the Dalai Lama receiving letters from unhappy women, mainly, who complained to him as the head of the church that they had been mistreated by their Tibetan teachers.
Teachers in the US and in Europe were concerned about the growing number of sexual and ethical scandals that were coming to light. Something needed to be done.
I have received many letters from women, many women, saying, please, what can be done? Do something.
I also received some letter about sexual abuse, ethical issues, these things. Through every effort, we must stop this kind of situation. So then, how to stop that's the question. Then we have to discuss.
We just said that this is not right. Teachers should not have sex with students. But if Your Holiness could join in on that kind of statement, it would give enormous power to it. It would help enormously.
I'm ready.
Whether or not other people are going to listen, that's another question.
I will shout. I can shout. That's better.
Teachers won't listen, maybe. The teachers who are having sex and drinking, they may not listen. But the students, they'll listen. They'll listen to you.
That will help.
Tremendously.
Then people can say no. If they know that it's wrong in your eyes, then people feel free to say no.
Because you are giving a standard which people trust in.
Right.
Towards the end of this meeting, the suggestion was that we write an open letter in which we would present what we had reflected upon and what we had decided, and hopefully arrive at some kind of resolution.
From March 16th to 19th, 1993, a meeting was held at Dharamsala between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and a group of 20 Western Dharma teachers.
I was charged with writing up of the text of this letter. I read this paper back to His Holiness.
In recent years, several Asian and Western teachers have been involved in scandals concerning sexual misconduct with their students. Students should be warned against the dangers of falling prey to charisma, exalted titles, exoticism.
One better way of doing this is, instead of citing these points as if they were sort of summations of His Holiness's responses, rather we could present them as some sort of consensus that they arrived at.
Actually, the reality also like that.
Yes.
Everyone participated. So everybody takes. Less budget already.
And say, well, maybe we should say this, maybe we should say that. Other voices also amongst the group suggested changes and so forth. And we arrived after a couple of hours at a text that we were all happy to put our names to.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And then the Dalai Lama said, first of all, we have to pass this letter through his private office. And then nothing happened for weeks. There was no response, there was nothing. And eventually, it did come back to me and the others. And the only thing that had changed was the Dalai Lama's name had been removed as a signatory.
In my childish eyes, the Dalai Lama was the embodiment of benevolence. Why didn't he intervene? I realized he was not only a spiritual guide, he was also a political leader. His priorities lay elsewhere.
En 1959, les Tibétains viennent d'échouer dans leur révolte contre Pékin. Bilan, 10 000 morts, l'échec d'un espoir et la longue nuit de l'exil dans un petit village de l'Inde pour le meneur de la révolte, le 14e Dalai Lama.
My name is Tenzin Geche. I served in the Office of Holiness for over 40-something years. Came out of Tibet when I was about 6 years. 1959, His Holiness the Dalai Lama came into India along with thousands of Tibetans. And then with the Dalai Lama, there was this whole government sort of setup, continued from Tibet. I remember in the early 60s, it was the time when His Holiness made appeals to world leaders for the issue of Tibet to be discussed in the United Nations. So we had all these letters to be typed for the heads of these countries. But I remember typing many. And because we didn't have computers, oh, it was terrible. One mistake, take out the whole thing, again type. In those days, it was actually a very exciting moment.
The Dalai Lama is both a political and a religious figure. There's always been a political dimension, especially at the beginning when they arrived from Tibet and were in exile. They were driven out, hunted. Many of them died. They reached India and had to find their place. They needed allies.
Right from the early times, when situations were very difficult among the Tibetans in exile, I think any kind of help, from outside was very welcome.
They needed supporters from Western countries.
Westerners are very inquisitive. They want to go, they want to explore, they want to find things, For example, in Dharamsala, it's very interesting. In the initial stage, it was mostly the hippies, who were not interested in Buddhism, but just to go to new places and
go after hashish and LSD or whatever, things like that. But then some of them have also, inquisitive mind. So then gradually less and less hippie and more, foreigners who really wanted to explore and find out Tibetan culture and Tibetan Buddhism. I am the director of this institute called the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives. The original idea of establishing this institute is preservation, promotion, and dissemination of Tibetan culture.
The quest for truth, wisdom, knowledge, and myself. I realized that in the West, we don't think about ourselves and aren't properly aware of ourselves. We're focused on the external. We want cars, power, money, television. We want to travel. We're always looking outwards, but never at what's happening inside of us.
Us hippies were probably not the best candidates for that sort of job, but we at least represented that world. We were a channel into the wider world that they now found themselves in.
For many who maybe even just studied or had contact with Tibetans for a year or two only, not too long, it was enough for them to have some kind of a close feeling for the Tibetans. And once they left Dharamsala, all involved with either some Dharma center or some Tibet support group.
Back in my parents' day, Buddhism was really becoming en vogue.
La France est en train de découvrir le bouddhisme. Des cérémonies comme celle-ci se multiplient et permettent facilement à des jeunes d'entrer dans cette religion.
Château de Plège en Saône-et-Loire, à 40 km d'Autun. Ils construisent ici les deux monastères qui abriteront la grande retraite initiatique bouddhiste de 3 ans, 3 mois et 3 jours, à l'issue de laquelle ils deviendront les premiers lamas occidentaux du bouddhisme tibétain.
C'est comme si le Tibet en étant
It's as if Tibet, having been physically expelled from its homeland, has managed, thanks to the Dalai Lama, to create what I would call a virtual, deterritorialized Tibet. Its monasteries and Tibetan Buddhism centers around the world constitute a kind of prefecture, acting on behalf of a virtual Tibet spread all over the globe.
Et là, d'un seul coup, il a
He
réalisé.
suddenly realized that he could link the political, spiritual, and cultural dimensions and save Tibetan culture through the spiritual desires of Westerners,
Des Occidentaux.
using those desires to put political pressure on China.
Pression politiquement sur la Chine.
14th Dalai Lama, will you please enter the podium and receive the Nobel Peace Prize for 1989 with a gold medal and the diploma.
When this award happened, it made it easier for governments and other organizations to say that, we're inviting His Holiness because he's a Nobel laureate.
The Tibetan branch is a minority among Buddhists, but it's the most successfully exported. Its success is mainly due to the Dalai Lama, who in just a few years managed to achieve iconic status. Everyone wanted their photo taken with the Tibetan leader, Bill Clinton, Jacques Chirac, and movie stars like Richard Gere. The cases of abuse multiplied as support for the Tibetan cause spread around the world.
I'm one of the few journalists who has focused exclusively on abuse by Buddhists for a long time. So people approach me constantly. Every 2 or 3 weeks, someone approaches me about some abuse somewhere in the world. Sometimes those people have been abused themselves, sometimes they have been witnesses to abuse, and they try to involve me in their case. Sogyal Rinpoche is one of the biggest abusers in Buddhism. Over the years, I think Sogyal made hundreds of victims just by, abusing them physically and sexually. And I'm not even including people who were worked until they dropped for nothing. This has been going on since the mid-1970s until the late 2010s, so that's a long period of time.
Ces fidèles appartiennent à une école bouddhiste de tradition tibétaine. Ils sont membres d'une association internationale appelée RIKPA et fondée par le Lama Sogyal Rinpoche, né et formé au Tibet, mais aussi à Cambridge.
I've lived in the West for many years now.
Ça fait plusieurs années que je suis en Occident et donc je commence à connaître un peu les conditions de vie ici. Et ce que j'enseigne, ce n'est pas le bouddhisme tibétain, mais j'essaye plutôt d'enseigner la sagesse de l'enseignement du Bouddha. Et j'essaye d'aider les gens. Je ne dis pas que j'ai réussi, mais au moins j'essaye.
I met him in Paris. I was at a large conference attended by 60 to 80 people. And there was a young Lama there called Sogyal Rinpoche. He spoke very good English, and he was very dynamic and aggressive when it came to the excesses of materialism and the failure of Western society in its quest for happiness.
L'échec de la société occidentale dans sa recherche du bonheur. Et puis voilà, une vision spirituelle de l'existence.
He had a spiritual vision of existence that was very committed, very practical, very connected to the modern world, which was pretty amazing at that time.
Extraordinaire à l'époque. Il se trouvait que je parlais anglais.
I happened to speak English. I was offered a job as a translator and interpreter working for Sogyal Rinpoche and other lamas too. One thing led to another, and I became president of RIKPA France.
Sogyal at some point wrote a book, or at least had a book written for him. And the Dalai Lama wrote a foreword to that book, so the book became a bestseller. And those tiny organizations grew bigger and bigger. So this is how a small-time Tibetan guy builds an empire all over the world.
Anyone interested in spirituality is familiar with the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Like many people, I was fascinated by it and intrigued by its author.
The book was a huge success in the English-speaking world when published in 1992, and a year later in French, German, and other languages. Hundreds of people began coming to the centers. Some really big centers developed in 10 or so countries. The US, various Western European countries, Australia, India. Then branches sprang up in other countries. Sogyal Rinpoche is a great entrepreneur. Truly excellent, the startup king of Tibetan Buddhism.
There were different type of people getting different type of treatments during retreats. The normal students and retreatants were told that the right way of living is a life where you renunciate material goods. And then there was the life of the inner circle and the lamas and the VIPs, which was one of luxury, good food. So there was a big discrepancy between the students and who were told to live in a certain way and the luxury I saw on the other side. Men and women in the inner circle had a task that was taking care of Sogyal, and it was clear that the most beautiful girls were with him almost day and night. Yet I accepted that they were there without asking myself the question if they had, for instance, other relationships with him. These girls were called the dakinis.
The dakinis had to be available to attend to any need at any moment. It was 24/7. Whatever he did during the day, he had to have assistance. We slept at the foot of his bed for a few hours. In the early months, I only slept 2 hours a night.
Les premiers mois, j'ai dû dormir 2 heures par nuit.
He either needed to go to the bathroom or to eat, or for us to scratch his back. He never washed alone. He had help with all these tasks. He didn't do anything on his own.
De manière indépendante. Slowly but surely, I understood that the beautiful women around Sogyal were having sexual relationships with him.
It's hard to use the word rape because it immediately puts me in the role of victim, and that's difficult to accept.
Qui est lourd à porter, simplement.
But yes, it was rape. He was a heavy old man with authority who would lock the door and force his way and make threats.
Qui s'impose et qui menace. Sogyal a très clairement dit.
Sogyal explained very clearly to me on the edge of his bed that if I told anyone, including the girls, then I would break the samaya between us.
Je briserais le samaya qui nous lie, donc le lien sacré qui nous lie.
The sacred bond, the vow of fidelity and loyalty to my master.
À son maître.
It would have terrible karmic consequences for me and my loved ones.
When Sogyal asked his disciples, in particular female disciples, to become concubines or to have sexual relations with him, We shouldn't see this as a departure from Buddhist norms. These things exist in Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, of Hindu origin. They exist, and there are texts speaking of these sexual rituals. There's also a notion of skillful means, or upayas. According to them, in order to convert someone to Buddhism, a teacher can employ all means possible, including violence and lies. I knew about rumors relating to Shagyam Trungpa, a role model for Sogyal, that these lamas had these women and were with them all the time. I had read a bit about what was happening, but I had no idea about you and what you'd experienced.
After the first incident with Sogyal, I was totally shocked. I felt terrible, but I didn't know what had happened to me and what to make of it. And of course I remembered that I'd been strictly forbidden from talking to anyone. During a lesson taught by Sogyal, I ran into Tsigar Control in the courtyard at Lerabling. He is a Tibetan teacher, another in the same kind of style as Sogyal. He's very open to the West and speaks English. A kind of modern, westernized guru. I had a question for him, and in tears, I asked him what it meant to be a consort, a concubine. There was a moment of silence. He fully understood why I was crying. And he simply replied that it's a really great opportunity to have this kind of relationship with a teacher. So again, a case of a teacher being witness to suffering and completely ignoring the issue.
That's very consistent with what I read elsewhere on what happened in Trungpa and Sogyal's entourages.
I had always wanted to be a nun since I was a little girl. But I didn't really believe in Christianity, so I couldn't see how I was going to be a nun, but I always knew I was going to be. Then I realized that the Buddha Dharma was the most important thing in all the world. In Buddhism, you have to see the object of your devotion as completely pure. But the problem comes that it also puts all the power in the hands of the guru and totally disempowers the student. If the guru is not perfect, then giving them everything is very dangerous. His Holiness had said that if we told him who the lamas were and were specific, he would make sure he did not visit those places. He still visited there.
And thereby gave them legitimation. For many of us, we felt was somewhat of a betrayal.
But it wasn't just the Dalai Lama who was cited as a guarantee. In our lawsuit against Guru Robert Spatz, I discovered that all representatives of Tibetan Buddhism were used to guarantee the credibility.
Your Honor, I have some photos to show the witness. Can you comment on this photo and date it?
It's the Dalai Lama on a visit to Brussels.
Did he express himself in English?
In English.
Who translated the Dalai Lama's words?
Mr. Spatz.
Who was seated next to him? Okay. And he translated everything?
Yes, I was sitting opposite.
Where are we here?
At the Tsampa.
In Brussels, and this is?
Mathieu Ricard. With Mr. Spatz. Rabjam Rinpoche, and I don't know who that is. A monk who was accompanying him.
From the Sechen Monastery?
Yes, from the Shechen Monastery.
It's clear that Mr. Spatz is always surrounded by individuals who are recognized within the Buddhist religion, acknowledged masters whose authority cannot be challenged.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Everything we were able to earn, we had to donate. Not just to Rigpa, but as an offering to your teacher, who is worth more than anything. There's nothing more precious than him. People paid to go to conferences and retreats. You were told it was a moment that had to be properly valued, and why you had to put money in the box, in cash if possible. Plus, there were ceremonies where gifts were given, in particular to Sogyal. You could give jewelry, whatever you wanted.
I was a monk. I carried like 60,000 euros and gold, into Delhi. It's definitely like a mafia. If you're going from anywhere to India or to Nepal, then they want to know, and they actually actively seek that information during retreat. You could help Sogyal by taking some luggage for him. And I had to carry this super hot jacket, like a leathery, not shiny leather, like a suede jacket or something that I'm scared to take off. Sogyal, he would phone me and say, "You have it? Okay. Don't lose it or you die," or something like that. If you lose it, don't come back. Don't. I was scared when I went through the customs thing. It was money donated by students at a retreat. It was for building in a monastery, which is up in the mountains.
The Dalai Lama visited Europe in September 2018. I and some other victims seized the opportunity to arrange a meeting with him in his suite on the top floor of this hotel. I recorded the conversation.
Ogyen Kyunsang Choling is using your image.
Yes.
And they are using this in court, in a judicial trial, as a way to legitimate a Buddhist center. This has to stop. You have to do something.
I think at least 15, 20 years ago, Dharamsala, one Western Buddhist teachers conference. Now I got some material to criticize.
We put it. So that in the future
You should not put whole responsibility on my shoulder.
No.
Lama.
During the interview, a victim told the Dalai Lama about her experiences with a guru who is still active.
If you're serious, then self-discipline comes.
Yeah, but Namka was not like that. Namka did a lot to women and girls.
Namka est un lama tibétain.
Namka is a 54-year-old Tibetan Lama who fled to Europe 20 years ago.
Il possède plusieurs
He has several centers around the world, including one in southern Spain.
Namka, there's a lawsuit against him. The woman is filing a complaint, but I'm the first who puts it in the news. Otherwise, nobody does about Namka.
I have been Namka Rinpoche's center. Then later, I got some sort of information. He, because of that too much, not a genuine Buddhist practitioner.
Yeah.
So now this material we need.
Yeah.
So that panda.
Evidence.
Evidence. So very good. Very good.
I wasn't the only one it happened to. Many lamas in the West found themselves in the same situation. I don't blame His Holiness for what he did. We have very good relations, and I completely understand his response. With regard to the Dutch woman who spoke to His Holiness, I know her. She's one of my students. She followed me for many years. I thought she had some devotion to me. Thinking about it now, I believe she was in love with me. For us, in Tibet, if a woman loves a Lama, she says to him, "I love you. Ask of me what you will." And the Lama replies either yes or no. In the West, it's not like that. She will try to find another way behind his back. If that doesn't work, she becomes angry and goes to court. Certainly, in the past, I made many mistakes with regard to the way I spoke to and interacted with students. This was because I wasn't familiar with how Western societies think. There are many different practices in Tibetan Buddhism. Some of them do not conflict with the law and are very beneficial. It is absolutely necessary that these are taught. On the other hand, some are incompatible with the times and the place we live and do not fit the Western mentality.
Despite a lawsuit in Switzerland and several communications to his office, the Dalai Lama did not respond. Namka is still teaching Tibetan Buddhism. In 2020, the Liège Court of Appeal sentenced Robert Sipas to a 5-year suspended prison sentence and financial reparations for his victims. He appealed, to a higher court. Château du Soleil continues to welcome visitors, and the OKC organization has never rejected the legacy of Robert's Spatz.